So let's start. When you will start doing your assignment, you have there in your GitHub repository that you've created, you have a README in which there are some steps. The first step is to open the site, which I opened previously, and I filled in previously because I don't have internet now. And here, basically, you generate a new project with some boilerplate in it. Okay? You have to select a Maven project. Does anybody know what Maven is?
It's a package.
I heard package and build. It's both. So
It's both.
yes, it's both. So it handles your dependencies for you. So before Maven and before package managers, really, you had to manually take the dependencies that you needed from the internet. So you'd go to the site of Spring, you would download the jar, let's say. I think with Spring it never happened, but let's just imagine. And you would include it in your project manually. Maven does it for you. So Maven downloads the dependencies for you and includes them in your application for you. And then the build part is you want to build your application as a jar, right? A jar is an archive. It's like exe-ish, but for Java, which contains your classes and contains the information about, for example, which is the main class, the class which has the main method. If there is no main method, there is simply a library, like a DLL in the exe world, let's say, that you can include in other jars. So you can include the jar in another jar, you can link them such that you reuse the classes in them. Okay? The difference between exe and jar is that the exe really runs machine code, meaning really on the CPU in the end, whereas a jar has bytecode in it. Bytecode is ran by a virtual machine, by the Java virtual machine, which translates this bytecode into machine code to be interoperable. So basically, what happens is that the same jar, you can run it on Linux and also on Windows. The exe, you can just run on Windows, and you have to build something else for Linux. Right? Okay, then for the language, you will choose Java. These are pre-chosen, really, so you don't have to do anything here. And the Spring Boot version is 2 point whatever, doesn't matter, just let it like it is. Just the requirement is that it has to be 2 point something, so not 1. Yes, Ivan?
Is it okay if we use Gradle for the build tool?
You can also use Gradle for the build tool, yes. So you can choose here Gradle if you really want. Anyway, it will be pretty easy what we do with Maven and Gradle. Okay. And here you have to specify some names to identify your artifacts. Maven and Gradle, if you really want, use these names to identify the dependencies that have to be downloaded. So when you want to refer to a dependency, you have to give the group, which is like, for example, org.spring framework, and the concrete artifact, like the core framework or the JPA part or the JDBC part and so on. And they also have some versions in them, which we will not really deal with. And then you can select dependencies. You just type in here the name of the dependency and you select them and it will be selected like this. So we will use Lombok, JPA maybe, JDBC, and Postgre as a database because that's what I have installed right now. And when you press generate, it will output a zip. And this zip I already have, and it's here. This is the zip. Okay, and you can extract it. My computer is completely in a chaotic mode, let's say, but let's ignore this. Okay, so we just extract all this stuff and we can already open it in IntelliJ. So the question is now if I know what I wrote. Yes. So you will see that IntelliJ is pretty smart in the way that it detects if a folder is a valid project. Basically, if you have this small black box in the folder icon, then it's a valid Java project and you can open it. So this is what I downloaded before, and I will open it. I hope that it's what I downloaded before. Oh, come on. Okay. And basically, after a little while, it will open it, and we can look in the POM. So this is for Maven. This is the file that contains information about what's your artifact group ID and name, or artifact ID in this case. Some descriptions, so some metadata basically, what's the Java version that you are using, and then the dependencies, right? You will notice that we don't have versions for these dependencies. Normally, you also have to specify a version. That is because Maven has an inheritance concept in which you can inherit configurations from the parent. In our case, we inherit from a Spring Boot, from the Spring framework, and the versions are managed by Spring then. Basically, the guys at Spring were very nice, so they said, okay, we have all this stuff that is used with our libraries. Let's compile a list of versions that are compatible with our version of library. So basically for the 2.1.3 version of Spring Boot, you will get some versions of the Postgre driver, of Lombok, and so on, that are for sure compatible with this version. Okay? Good, and then the build part is here. Basically, again, the Spring guys were very nice. They created a plugin that does all the build stuff for us. So we don't have to configure anything to get the jar. We just have this, and it works out of the box. If you really want to package it in a jar, you can just go here at Maven projects, and you can do a clean and package if you really want, and that would create a jar. I will not do this because I'm not sure if it will not need internet, so we'll just leave it as it is. Apart from that, we will have a Git Ignore file. This file is very good for excluding stuff from Git. So for example, would you commit your exe file to Git? Okay, I see some heads shaking.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, why?
Well, it's a release.
If it's a release.
If it's a release, of course.
But randomly when you're working?
No.
No. Okay. Why not? And also if a release is debatable, but I would look at it.
It's probably platform dependent.
It's platform dependent.
If
True.
someone wants to build the project on Linux, it's useless.
Yes.
And it's probably a larger and can't do anything with it. I mean, it can't. It's useless to track changes in the.
Yes. So basically, to conclude it somehow, so it might be large, the output that we have. It might be platform dependent. In our case, not really because it's Java. But the most important thing that you remarked very well, it's a binary file in which it's very hard to track changes. So if all of us are working together on this project and all of us are building the project all the time to run it, then we'll have conflicts all the time when we push our code, because on each line of code that you change, the output of the build will change probably. And because it's a binary file, it changes basically completely. So it will not be a normal merge in which some lines are taken from your version and some from mine. It's simply a conflict that you have to resolve manually. So then all the stuff that is generated, all the stuff that is platform dependent or IDE dependent, usually is excluded. So here we can see this. For example, this target is excluded because in the target you have the compiled classes. Then this IntelliJ stuff is excluded because what if you are not using IntelliJ, or what if you are using an older version of IntelliJ that is not compatible with my version? Then we will have problems if both of us get the same files. And they exclude also NetBeans, and in this case, I would say Eclipse, more or less stuff. So that's the content of this file. Any questions for these two files? Okay, good. And then we enter the real code. So the real code that was generated is this. We have one application class, a test class, and the application properties. We will take them one by one. The application class is the main class. It has a main method, which basically starts up the Spring application. This is the entry point for our code, which then defers to the Spring framework. So now Spring framework will be in control, and it will instantiate the class that we need, and it will call the classes that we mark to be called, and so on. Right? It's important that it is marked with Spring Boot application, and it is very important that all our classes reside in either this package or sub-packages of this package, because Spring automatically scans all the sub-packages and this package for classes annotated with component or with repository and stuff like this, right? So it's very important that this class stays in the root of your project and all your other classes are beneath it, basically. Okay? Then we have an application properties file, which is empty. Spring provides a mechanism through which you can configure various things, also in your classes and also in the Spring framework, and not use constants in the code. If you think about second-year database design, you probably wrote some PHP, or I'm not sure what you wrote, to connect to the database, and you hard-coded the database URL, the database password, the database username inside the code. So you had the code and you had some kind of constants in which you had this. We will use it, we will put them here and not inside the code, really. And actually the advantage is that we can externalize this even outside of the jar, so this info can be pulled from the environment and not in the build jar. Okay, and lastly we have a test which does nothing really, just sees that our application does not die. That's what they generated and what we will use to write code. Questions? No questions? Good. Then, first, let's discuss what we will do. We will do a simple CRUD queue, meaning create, read, update, delete, and query for one entity. And we will do it in memory and with JDBC. I will probably not implement all methods, but I'll just show you one or two methods how to implement them, and then you can go on. And that one entity will be the question entity, maybe a little simplified. Right? So first, the first thing that you have to think about is that you need a database table. And in your case, you will need more database tables probably, and some relationships and so on. Now, what you did in database design is that probably you opened the MySQL workbench and you pressed there create new table, and it's popped up a dialog, and then you selected some columns and so on. That's bad, very bad. Why? What if you formatted your computer? You lost that stuff probably, right? But the code, maybe you pushed it to Git. You can pull the code, but the database is no longer there. So you'll have to recreate the tables by hand again. That's one point. The second point is, what if you're working with somebody? You have to tell him, okay, I created the table with this name, and so on. And the third point, which actually happened to me with my projects in the university, is what if I forgot what I created? And I formatted my computer, or I lost it, or whatever, it broke down in the meanwhile. Well, I have to go in the code and see what queries I'm making against those tables to see how they were named, what columns they had, and so on. So that's very bad, right? We want to not do this, and I will teach you something that actually is a bonus point. So it's a free bonus point, basically. First, I'll have to add another dependency because I forgot about it initially when I did this. So I have to add the Flyway dependency. And it's pretty easy to add. I don't want to specify a version. Okay, so it's also managed through the Spring parent. And when you change the POM, the IDE will ask you, do you want to enable auto import? What does that mean? When I change the POM, to automatically re-import the dependencies. And I say enable because I'm a lazy person. Okay. And that's it. You might wonder how come it works without internet, because I don't have internet.
It takes from the local repository.
Exactly. So Maven has repositories on the internet. There are some Maven repositories on the internet. They are, I think, free by default that it uses, and you can configure more. You can have private repositories and so on. But when you download for the first time a specific jar, so a specific artifact for a specific group and for a specific version, it saves them somewhere locally. I can show you. It's probably horrible, but let's just look at it. So it's in my user folder in M2 folder. And here there are all the libraries that I ever downloaded. So we can look for the Flyway, for example. It should be in org, Flyway, core, whatever version, and here is the jar. So all of this stuff has been downloaded previously because I used this before. So then I don't need internet, and it doesn't download it every time, because those repositories, of course, don't have unlimited internet. They also have a bandwidth. So this is an optimization, let's say a cache. Okay. Then, so what will we do? We will create, and it's very important that it is in this directory, we will create a DB migration folder inside the resources folder, right? So basically, if we look in, where is it? Don't I have a show in? Okay. If we look in Windows Explorer, we will see that basically I created a new DB folder in which I have a new migration folder. It's very important that it's exactly like this, right? And in here I can put some SQL files that will be run when my application starts. So what does this mean? This means that I can version my database structure together with my code. So I cannot really forget it, and it's a lot easier to maintain it. Actually, Flyway has another advantage, because if you think that you will just write your database code once and never change it, you are very wrong. In real life, you change the database very frequently, or you change it frequently, let's say. So it also has a versioning mechanism. Basically, the names of the SQL files have to be in a certain format, and based on that format, they are executed in an order. So all versions have to start with V, and then the number. So it will be V1, V2, V3, and so on. And they will be executed sequentially. First V1, then V2. And if in a month V3 appears, it will be also executed, right? Okay, so I created an initial schema SQL. So it's very important that it is V, the number, and 2 underscores, and then some random stuff that you want. And here I can create a table. Question, let's say, and with an ID. I'm using Postgre, so there is a special type called serial, which is an integer which auto-increment itself. So when I insert the first record, it will be 0. The next one will be 1, and so on. I don't have to care about this incrementation. It is like the auto-increment flag in MySQL, if you used it. And this is the primary key. Then it has a title, which is a varchar, let's say, of 32 and not null. Then there is a text, which is also a varchar of 64, which is not null as well. And it's enough, I guess. So let's say that this is the simple entity that we will create, right? Yes.
Sorry. It says that no data source are configured to run this SQL.
Add new data source should file.
MySQL.
So, 1 second. I did not get there.
Okay.
So if you go ahead, I will not answer.
I just saw the warning. I can see.
So I did, the warning.
Yeah, it's warning.
Ignore it.
Okay.
Doesn't matter. basically you can treat it as a text file. Okay, what would happen if I try to run my app now? So this will be run by my app, just so that it's clear. When my app starts, Spring calls Flyway, Flyway initializes the database. So basically my app is self-contained and knows to initialize itself, right? It's a very powerful concept. So if I run my app, I just go to my main class and run my main method, it will die, for sure. Let's see why. So it builds, it parses. Exactly. We don't have a database connection. So it tells me, okay, you have a problem here and you should consider using an embedded database or so on. How do we configure a database connection? Well, for sure, not by hard coding the URL and so on in the code, but we use the application properties. And here I will just copy paste something because I don't have internet. I would show you how I found this and so on, but I don't have internet. So let's just look what I put in here. So I put the database URL first, which is JDBC. This is the protocol that is used to communicate between Java and the database. J is for Java, DB, communication or connect or whatever. Then the next segment is the database. If you use MySQL, it will be JDBC, MySQL, and then the rest. So this is the protocol path. And then we have the address. Here can be an IP if you have a server, or can be localhost if your database is running on your computer. Again, I don't have internet, so there is no other computer. It's only my computer here. So I have my PostgreSQL database on localhost. Then the port is for Postgre, it's this one. For MySQL, it's 3306, I think. That's the default port, but it can run on any port, really. And at the end is the database or the schema name, which is used, or which should already exist, basically. Then I configure the username and the password. All these properties that are supported by Spring are located in a document, or most of them, and I can give you the link. I would show it to you now, but I don't have internet. Okay. Then this one is an interesting property that you should never use in production, but you should always use when developing locally, or you should sometimes use it at least. What does it do? Let's imagine that I would run this SQL schema on my database, and then I would change it. So I would run this SQL file and then I would change it. Basically, Flyway does not know to interpret the file. It only knows to run it. It does not parse it. It does not understand it really. So it cannot detect what you changed, right? If I change a column, basically it cannot say that it has to add a column because it does not detect this. What it does, it simply knows to run files. So how it works is that it creates a table, which is called Flyway schema version. We will see it immediately, in which it stores what migration files, what SQL files are already run, and the checksum for these files. If I change the file, the checksum will change, and basically Flyway will throw error and say, I cannot continue, you changed the file, it was already executed on this database, and you have to manually now go and solve the problems that you created. Now, when I'm developing locally, I don't care about this. And with this flag that I set here, when this happens, when the validation throws an error, they just delete everything in my schema and recreate everything. What would happen on a productive database if I put this? Well, you don't have anymore any data after this runs, so it could be a problem. Another situation in which this could happen is if you create V1 first, you run it, then you create V0. So something that should run actually before V1. Because it executed already V1, it says, okay, I am at a higher version and you're trying to apply now basically a version from the past. So it would also give an error, right? So use this flag when you do the assignments, but just keep in mind if you do something to your SQL files, you will lose the data. Okay, and this one just put it there. It's just to hide some logs which are stupid in case of Postgre.
I have a question. You said
Sure.
that these files are run each time you run the application, or you start with the first time, right?
When you start the first time, they are run, yes.
So just the first time when you run it, that's the moment when it creates the database. And after that, just checks to see that there was no change.
Yes, partially. So this database, it creates a database table, as I said, in which it stores what files were run. If you add new files, at the next start of your application, it will detect that these files were added, and it will run only those files. Right? And if you change the files, then it happens what we discussed, that if they were already run, that there is a problem and it throws an error.
So the files I add might extend the files I already run.
Exactly. So how it is used in production, so all that I'm explaining to you today is stuff that is used in the industry today. So everything is really used. I've used them in my projects, or my developers use them in my projects, and they are really used in reality. How it looks like, we have one project which is at version, you can also use dots in the versions. So they have something like 200 version files, and now we are considering to flatten them. Basically, you incrementally add new tables, you alter old tables. So you do alter table. Basically, if you are at V4, you can assume that all the artifacts created in V1, V2, and V3 exist. So you can do alter table on those artifacts without any problems because they will be run first, and then. So that's basically the idea, that you incrementally create your database and add new stuff and so on.
And would it be more logic to run just the latest version rather than all the versions?
Could be, but the idea, and yes, you can leave if you want. The idea, and I will put it on YouTube, so you can look over it. The idea is the following. Let's imagine the following scenario. We created assignment 1, let's say, with the feature to create new questions and add tags. And we deployed it on a productive system, meaning that we already have users which already created questions, so we have some data, and the users are already using our application, right? And now we want to add a new table, right? One approach would be to simply create a new version which includes everything, also the old tables. But we already have data in those old tables, so if we drop them and recreate them, it will be a mess, right? So the idea is that you have to consider what was the first version and simply alter and create the new table separately, just so that the productive system still has data at the end and in a consistent state. Right? The alternative, and what was used for a very long time, was that, for example, Hibernate, which we will see next week, can also generate tables for us. And the problem with that is that you don't know for sure when you deploy a new version of your app in production what stuff it will run. Because it will determine at runtime that there are new entities, it means that it has to create new tables. There are new columns, it means that it has to alter the existing tables and add the new columns. And then you might incur data loss. So for example, if you rename the column, it's not completely clear if the old column should be dropped and a new one should be created, or if the column should be simply renamed. Is it semantically the same column, or are there two columns with the same data type, but which contain separate data? Right, so that's the idea. We want to preserve the database with data in it and to incrementally build it. And another way in which this was done in the past, well, you guys, not me, but you guys, had to go manually in production and run SQL scripts by hand. Would you feel comfortable to do this, knowing that if you do a mistake, you fuck up the productive database? Probably not.
Exactly.
Some of us already did that. Yes, it happens. I also sometimes have to go in the productive database, but trust me, it's something that you don't want to do by hand.
Some entities weren't versioned correctly,
Mm-hmm.
and the specific use case when you want to add more functionality
Mm-hmm.
and there's not backwards compatibility.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So a massive update occurred.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, so this can happen anyway. Okay, let's try to run it again. Let's see if it works this time. If I don't have a SQL error, it should work. Yes, so exit code 0, meaning that there was no error. And we can check the logs just to see what happened. Basically, I'm interested in these logs, these ones. First, it cleaned my database because I had from the other semi-group, the tables already there. And it created this schema history in which it stores the versions that were already run. I would show you in pgadmin, but pgadmin seems to need internet to run. I don't know why. Then it detected, after it cleaned it, that it is an empty schema, so it migrated version 1, which was successful, right? And the table is now there. If I would restart it, we can, or I already saw that there were less logs from the DB. So it detected that it's at version 1, so it's up to date and no migration was necessary. If I had it if I would add version 2, it would say current schema is version 2, and it would apply version 2, and then it would continue. Okay? So that's Flyway. If you use this, you have a bonus point or half a point. I don't remember, you can see on the Git. Okay. Now, the next step is to create our model. So I create a new package called model, and I create a Java class which represents my table. So I just have a ID, and I have a title, and I have a body. I think I called it, or text. Text is fine. Okay. And lazy man solution incoming. I put data annotation and I have getters and setters. And let me think. So I will create a no argument constructor and an all arguments constructor. And that's it. So this is my class. Has a constructor which takes no arguments and leaves all this null or 0 in the case of the int. And the all arguments constructor which gets an ID, a title, and a text and simply sets them. Right? So this is to remove the boilerplate that I don't want to write. Okay. Then I will create a package for the persistence. We can call it a repository, or let's say persistence. Okay, and let's go with the proposed thing to have an API package. And here I will create my interfaces. So I want to have a question repository, which is an interface. And what do I want this interface to be able to do? Well, I want to create and update stuff. I will just call this save, both create and update in a single method. You will see why, maybe. So this is my save method. Then I will have a find by ID method, in which I give the ID. This is the read. Then I have a remove method, which removes a question. And finally, let's do a simple query, read everything. So find all. Why did I use optional here? What is optional? So this is an interview question, really. So what I ask usually mid-level developers.
It's a generic, right?
It's a generic.
It's a class that signals the existence or absence of a value and is much better than handling null pointer exceptions.
Exactly. So null is considered to be a horrible mistake, and that's why there are languages which do not have null. Why? Because null generates exceptions at runtime, meaning if you return null and the guy who is calling your method does not do if else, he will probably generate a null pointer exception when he tries to use the stuff that you returned. Optional is something introduced in Java 8, which is basically a simple wrapper which has two states. Either it is empty. It's like a glass of water which cannot be half full. It is either empty or full. If it's full, it has one element in it. If it's empty, it's just empty. Basically, if you have a method like this, you, by contract, should always return something. You should never return null. You should return either an empty optional or an optional which contains a question. And this is done such that you avoid completely null pointer exceptions. This makes sense in this case because if you pass ID 5000 and we only have one question or no questions, then instead of returning null, we return an empty optional. Okay? Good. Now Eclipse IntelliJ is doing something that I don't like, but whatever, you will see immediately. So I will create a repository factory. And this is a simple interface which returns the question repository. Oops. Okay. This is a functional interface. In Java 8, functional interfaces were introduced, which are interfaces which have one method, which is not implemented. And functional interfaces can be implemented with lambdas. So you can write inline implementation for this interface without having to define a class and so on. Right? And you can mark if you want it with annotation, which is functional interface, which is simply to, let's say, the helper annotation, which throws an error. If I would now add another method here, like void something, it would say that there is an error. It cannot be a functional interface, so it prevents you from adding new methods to stuff that was used as a lambda. Okay. Then the next one, we create a new package for memory. So the in-memory implementation, and actually I have to move it upwards with a level because I don't want it to be in the API. Right, so the API is here, and next to it is the memory, the in-memory implementation. And I will create an in-memory question repository, okay, which will implement, and here I can maximize it, will implement the question repository, right? So I have to implement all these methods. You can already see that the IDE does this null thing, which we don't like, that it returns null by default from these methods. But here, actually, it did a more intelligent thing. It returned the empty optional. Okay, and how will we store it in memory? Well, I propose to have a map between the ID, which is an integer in our case, and the question. And yeah, that's more or less it. So here, the first thing that I will do, I will write here synchronized, and I want to tell you to tell me what does it mean first. What does this synchronized thing do?
It's kind of lock.
Exactly, it's a kind of lock. Basically, if we have two threads, they cannot call this method in the same time. And I will show you why. So if my question has an ID which is different from 0, then I will update it. So basically, I will do something like data put. So this is an existing question that I simply want to update. Otherwise, I have to assign an ID to it, and then basically I'm creating it otherwise. So how should I compute this ID? Let's do it like this. This is one version. Right, I just take the size and I add 1. This is a weak version, and we will discuss immediately why. So I just say, okay, question set ID of ID. Actually, here I'm repeating myself a little, but whatever. Oh, man, I'm a little tired, I guess. Okay, and in the end, I just return the question, right? I return it because I changed the ID, so it might be a new instance actually. In our case, it's the same instance. Why is this weak?
Because we can delete something and make the comments and
Exactly. This is a very bad idea, actually. A better idea would be something like this, but I still don't like it really. Okay, and here I just say actually I could remove this if else, whatever, you get the point. But it's still synchronized, so I need to synchronize it. I will not write this, but I will just tell it to you. You can actually do this without synchronized. And concurrent hash map. So basically the hash map is not thread safe. If you insert two things into it in the same time, it might do something really random. So we would have to replace this hash map with a concurrent hash map, so hash map that can be concurrently accessed. And the second point that we have to change would be this ID allocation, and we could use an atomic integer. So integer that we ensure that the incrementation is done atomically, and if we would do that, we would not need the synchronize anymore. Okay?
we need the synchronization because we work with the database, or it's a good practice in the
It's a good practice. So this is a singleton class by design because we keep the data in a variable, in an attribute of this class. So if we have two instances, we would have two sets of data. So by design, it's a singleton. It will be only one. And if you have a singleton, it should always be thread safe, because in all web applications that you write in Java, you will be in a multi-threaded environment. And if you're in a singleton, it means that there are extremely high chances that two threads will try to access it in the same time. So it's a very good practice to be thread safe here. Okay, then find by ID. To implement it, pretty simple. We say optional of nullable, meaning it takes an object that can be null and transforms it into optional. This is a factory method, by the way. So it's a method, a static method that creates instances. Factory method. And we do this on data get ID, right? And that's our find by ID. Remove. It's also pretty simple. We just do data, and here we have to do something. Here again, we are changing the map, so it will have to be synchronized. And find all, again, pretty simple. Right, we create an array out of, or a list, array list, out of the values from the map. And this is our simple CRUD repository. Looks easy or not?
It's not that complicated, but I for myself have to think at each step, so it would take much longer for me to write.
Yes, well, here the experience comes into play. Actually, to be honest, I never wrote such a repository before, so I'm not sure if it's really experience in this case. And also with JDBC is the same problem for me, but okay, because I don't really use JDBC. Actually, I don't really write code that much these days. Okay, let's do the JDBC repo. This one, we will use something from Spring, which simplifies your life a lot, because I don't want to make you be very sad. If you go to the course, I think it will be, or I think the teacher will present a little about JDBC, I'm not sure. If she will present it, she will talk about connections, prepared statements, and all other stuff like this, which is very good for you to know at a theoretical level, but nobody's manually creating connections these days and executing prepared statements on them. So we will do something else. Okay, so what we will use, it's a JDBC template from Spring, which simplifies our simplifies the execution of JDBC. Right? JDBC means simple SQL that you write as strings inside your class, more or less. And I will put a required argument constructor because this is final. So this is, again, Lombok, which creates a constructor for me, so I don't have to write it by myself. Right? Why did I have to do it? Because if I have a final field, I have to initialize it in my constructors. That's the purpose of this final. Why I have it final is because I expect it to never change. So I don't want anybody to change it. And this implements, of course, the question repository. And I implement all the methods. Okay, let's start with the easier ones. Let's do find all. So let me think how to, let's just start it. So on the template, I have a query method, which takes two parameters, the SQL query and the class which knows to transform the result set into POJOs. The result set is very primitive in the way that you access columns and rows individually somehow. So we will just use this. So for example, For example, I will just do a select star from, what is it, question, I think it's called. And here I can create my row mapper using a lambda. So I just put a lambda and that's it more or less, but I did not extract the data yet. So this lambda will be called in a loop by the framework for each row that I got. The row number is in this I, which I will not use because I don't care about the number, but if you care in any way about the number, you can use this I. This result set is a standard Java class, which you can use to access each column individually, either by name or by index. So in our case, the first column, so the column with number 1, would be ID, and number 2 would be title. I think I created it in this order, and then 3 would be text. But we also can do it by name. So I can do it like this. So result set get int, because the ID is an int. Then result set get string for the title, and result set get string for the text, I think, yes. And this is all the stuff that I had to do. If you would want to use vanilla JDBC, you have to create a query, you have to create a connection, then you have to create a prepare statement with this, and then you execute it and you get this back, and then you have to manually iterate through this result set to do all this stuff. We just wrote 2 lines of code, and actually this lambda, you can extract it into a class because you will need it, for example, for find by ID as well. I am lazy right now and I'll copy paste it, but you should extract it to a class or to at least a static variable, a static field. Okay, let's do also the find by ID. There are multiple ways in which you can do it, but I am sure that the first idea that you have would be to do a query with select star from question where, and then ID equals, and you would say like this. This would be your first approach, right?
Bad idea.
Bad idea. Why? SQL injection. So if this, in the case of an int, it's not really a problem. If it would be a string, it would be a big problem. And this is, I tried it with Sinu, and I'm really surprised that they don't have the SQL injection problems. But what you could do, if this would be a string, you could say in the ID variable, you could put something like 1, so the number 1, and then a semicolon, and then to do some other SQL, because you could run multiple statements basically. So you would just terminate this statement, you don't care about the results, and then you do something like drop users from, right? And actually this happened a lot. So 15 years ago, this was the hype. Everybody would write in all input fields on all websites, 1, and then a semicolon, and then to write drop, blah, blah, or describe, blah, blah. And some sites would have this problem, and you would see then, basically, if you do this, for example, you can write a query in MySQL to see all the tables. You could select from the database schemata. And basically, I've seen one example, I don't remember what site it was, in which they just wrote that and they pressed login or something to send the stuff to the backend. And then beneath the login button, you would see a whole chunk of SQL results. And then you could just browse through the tables and see everything. So this is bad. How do we do it? We use a placeholder. And then the next parameter that we can pass this is one version, there are multiple versions. So we can put here the ID and copy paste this. And I will explain in 1 second. Maybe it looks better like this. Okay, so basically I put here a placeholder. I could put more, 3, 4, and then here I put the concrete values, right? And I could put here 3, 4, how many values. The order is important. So if I would have 2 question marks, because I filter by 2 different parameters, the first value in this object array should be for the first question mark and the second for the second question mark. Basically, the database would escape my values such that it's impossible to do SQL injection, right? So if I include any kind of special characters, it would escape them nicely. So this prevents any kind of SQL injection for modern databases. Also, databases had flaws with this in the past, but this should, if you have a good database driver, so a modern one and a good database, this should prevent any kind of SQL injection. Okay, so I execute the query, but what am I doing with the results? Nothing really. So I am storing the result. This is one version. Again, you can do it maybe better. So I get a list of questions, and I could have either 0 or 1. Because I queried by ID, it's impossible to get 2 results back. So I say if it is empty, then I return empty optional. Otherwise, I return optional which contains the first element of this list. Okay. Is this part, the read part, clear?
Can you explain one more time? Why actually creating that object?
Array. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So this is how this query method was defined, let's say, because you could have multiple placeholders, right? And this being the second parameter, you cannot really pass 3, 4 parameters. They would have needed to overload this method with 2 parameters, 3 parameters, 4 parameters, and so on. And this allows you to have n. You can have as many as you want, but you have to wrap them into this array to be able to group them into a single parameter for this method.
So that's basically because we have more placeholders, but
Yes.
here is the simplest case. When
1, yes. Yes, but this is a generic class, so it should be able to handle any kind of situations, this JDBC template. So because you can have multiple placeholders, this is the mechanism through which they want you to pass the stuff, simply just to support situations if you have 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 right? As I said, the alternative, there are two alternatives, and I don't know why they didn't go for the second one. The first one is to have overloaded methods for one parameter, for two parameters, for three parameters, and so on, which is stupid. And the second one would have been to put this parameter at the end and allow var args parameter. So variable amount of parameters. I'm not sure why they did not do it. It might be because of the way that, because this is an object parameter. You could pass an integer, you could pass a string, and I think then the compiler would have had some problems with the results mapper, with the row mapper. It might have not always detected correctly which method you are calling, I guess, because this query method is overloaded anyway already in a lot of ways. So, and I think actually I could have done it like that if I'm looking now at it. Let's see. Let's test this hypothesis. So if I move it here and I put simply ID, actually in that case I think I might actually simplify it. Okay. So they also have this with the var args. So then, because this last parameter is a var args, see, this object dot dot dot, it would allow you to pass multiple parameters and it would work. Good observation, very good. Okay, the remove is exactly the same, but just with delete. Let's do it very fast. Actually, do you want to take a 5 minutes break before we continue?
Maybe I can write the next one to be, I don't know, a unit.
Okay. So then I will write a delete. So here what I'm doing, I'm just doing a template update. The update itself does not return a result set, does not need a mapper, a row mapper, because we just update the database, we don't pull anything from it. So here I just say delete from question where ID equals, and here again, would you concatenate? No, you would put a placeholder. And that's it. So this is the update. Yes, this is the delete, sorry. We're using this update method. It's a little misleading that it says update. Actually, you just have to think of it like this. Query is for reading stuff. Update is for modifying stuff. So inserting and deleting and updating. And here, we will do this after the 5-minute break. Okay? So at 7:05, please be back. Okay, so the last method is the save method. Actually, I was thinking that for the save method, it would have been good if I actually had the ID as an integer and not as an int, because as an int, 0 is a valid value actually for the ID. With integer, I could have had null in the ID to distinguish between updated and created objects with the save method. I'm using a save method instead of two different methods just because this is a practice. Usually repositories don't have a create and updates, just have a save, right? So I would recommend you to have the ID as an integer, so this integer class and not int, just to be able to have null values in it. For us, it's a little late right now, but yeah. Okay, so inside it, though, I can have a private method which does insert, because we are really at the database level, so we can do this. So we insert a question and we return the ID. And we will have another method which can return nothing, which updates the question. Okay, so for update, I don't really have anything interesting to show you, because actually it will look like this. So I will say update question and then set title equals question mark. I think it's like this, if I remember correctly. And how is it? Text equals question mark. I'm not completely sure about this comma here, but whatever. I guess you guys will find out if I should have written and here or comma. I haven't written an update statement in a very long time by hand. Okay, and here I actually have to do the question get title and question get text, right? Just to verify, so the first one is the title, the second one is the text, and the last one is the ID, right? So nothing really fancy about it. Now, the insert is a little more complicated because we need to get back the ID, right? The ID is generated at the database level. If you remember, we can check here, we used this serial data type. In MySQL, you can use an integer with auto increment to obtain the same thing. Basically, when we insert, we get back the ID. And we want to obtain this ID to be able to pass it back in the pod row. Okay, so how do we do this? There are several ways. There is the horribly complicated way of doing it with native JDBC, and there is the Spring-ish way of doing it better and simpler. And it is like this. We will use a simple JDBC insert. So this is a command pattern, basically. So in this simple JDBC insert, I have to set the name of the table in which I want to insert. So question. Then I have to set the name of the generated key, ID. In this case, it's the name of the column that contains the key. And then I have to set the data, basically. So I will have to create a map between the name of the column and the value of the column. Okay, so data, and then we put, for the title, we just put the title, and for the text, we put the, oh, not the title, but the text. Right, this is the data. And what we do, we simply do insert, execute, and return key. I think this is the method in which I pass the data and I get back a number. I just do int value to force it to be a primitive integer. Right? This is the more relaxed way of doing it, and behind the scenes it creates a query with prepared statements and so on. Okay, this is the easiest way that I think you can do it with JDBC. Any questions related to this approach? No, I guess it's pretty obvious, right? Behind the scenes, of course, it creates an insert statement, but we don't do it by hand just because we need to get back the key. If we would not need the key, we would simply do like this with insert, right? But because we need the key, it's a little more complicated with JDBC, and this simplifies it a lot for us. Yes?
Are there similar methods for the other operations? Like for the ones that we have written the command by hand?
There are some other simple JDBC, but just a call. I would say that just for insert it makes sense, because the other stuff, the insert is very simple, right? The insert, you have a table and you have some columns that you set to some values. That's it. For select, for example, you can do joins, you can do a lot of other stuff, which we will see next time, that for JPA, so with Hibernate, there is a query builder that you can use, a criteria query builder, which you can use to create also joins and where clauses and so on by calling methods and not writing SQL. Okay? What is the problem actually with JDBC? The problem is a lot of our code are strings, right? This is
shouldn't hard code strings.
Yes, we shouldn't hard code strings, And actually, it's a little bad because we can misspell them. So what would happen if here I write? It would compile, but this table does not exist, right? And we only see at runtime if we have problems. The nice thing with something like this is that we know that a valid insert will be created. We just have to be careful about the name of the table and the columns. And also that can be fixed somehow. Okay. And the last glue that we need to do is simply if the question does not have an ID, which again would be better if the ID is not a primitive, so I don't check with 0, which is not that great. So if it has an ID, then we just do an update on the question. If it has an ID, we insert the question, we get back the ID, and we set the ID to this value. Of course, I could have written this in one line. I just wrote it in two for you guys. Okay, and that's the code. Right? It already complains, for example, about this title that I used it 3 times. This is one of the problems with this approach. Okay, so this is more or less how you write a repo. Okay, and I want to show you, this is the last thing that I will show you, what I will put on GitHub, because I will not put this, I will put a running example, which has all the stuff that we did today with a different entity, with a student entity, but it's the same thing. So, and with some other tables. So for example, here I created more tables, but just one set of repositories. So here you can find the in-memory repositories, JPA-based, JDBC-based, and Spring Data-based repositories. The Spring Data stuff is just optional, but I include it just for reference. So the repos themselves are pretty clear, right? We just created simple classes, which we expect to instantiate in factories, right? Now, the factories are the entry point, or factories will be instantiated by Spring. So we don't want to instantiate by hand the factories, as we discussed before. So how we can do it is, for example, like this. This is the in-memory repository factory. So what I did, of course, I created my repo with new, and I basically, well, I created it once because it's a singleton, as we discussed before, because we have this map inside, and if we would have two, we would have 2 data sets basically. We annotated it with component because we want Spring to instantiate it, so we don't want us by ourselves to instantiate it. And this is an optional task that I already solved for you, more or less. And the task is, if you remember, to switch between factories based on a property. In Spring, you can make a component to be conditional, meaning that it is instantiated only if this property in application properties has this value, right? So if I look in application properties, I have this property that I already referenced, which has a different value than memory. What does this mean? At runtime, Spring ignores this factory and does not instantiate it. It's as if it does not exist, basically, for Spring. Right? And if we go in each factory that I created, I have this conditional on property, but with a different value, right? So here is the value JPA, in JDBC, the value is JDBC, and so on. So I can switch then through the application properties between the factory implementations easily. Is it clear? Okay, and this is, as I said, the standard Spring mechanism that you can use on components. Okay, and for example, in the case of the JDBC repository, I get the template from Spring. Spring automatically creates a JDBC template for us, which is thread safe, so you can use it in several threads, and I don't have to instantiate it at all. Basically, it's there, and I can just use it. If I have a component, it will be automatically put in here by Spring. Okay? Okay, and then let's see how I do the rest of the stuff. So we have a service. My service is very simple. I'm not sure why, whatever. It's very simple. I just do a call to the repo, but you will have some business logic. Okay? So my service simply lists all students. I annotated it with service, which is simply a component which has a different name. You can also use component, it's okay. Service is simply just to recognize the role of it. And I get the repo factory through Spring. Again, because this is a component, as I said, service is a specialization of component. I get this, and basically the concrete type depends on what property I have in application properties. Because of this conditional, only one will exist at a time, and Spring will inject it. The next thing that I want to show you is this. If you remember, we discussed last time about transactions. I am very lenient in the way that I don't want you guys to manage transactions. Normally, my code will look probably this long, so 10 lines of code additionally, just to take the transaction, do a try catch, close the transaction at the end, maybe roll back or commit depending on what happened, and so on. Spring does this for us. You just annotate your service methods with transactional. This is from the Spring packages. And because there is another annotation called transactional, which is from a different package, so you have to be careful to take the Spring one. And what it does, when the code enters your method, it creates a new transaction. All your database changes that are done inside the method are put in this transaction. If your code returns and does not throw exception, it commits the transaction. If your code throws an exception, it rollbacks the transaction. Right? So pretty robust, and I would say that you use it and not manually create transactions and commit and so on. Okay? So this, you have to have it on your service layer, otherwise you are not in a transaction, and things that you do on the database will never be committed. So you just would put it in a default transaction which never gets committed. Or you would get an error, depending what you will use. Okay? And then lastly, I have a so-called console controller, as I called it, which basically reads from the console stuff. Here, it's a component which gets the service through a required arguments constructor. So I have a constructor which gets this service. And I implement a Spring specific thing, which is a command line runner. This command line runner is called at the end of all the Spring initialization. So after this Flyway is called, after all the other stuff, at the end, this will be called. And this method actually will be called, and here we can do a loop or a while, whatever, and we read commands from the command line, and we do, for example, I've created here a simple thing that prints enter a command, and then if it's a list, I list all the students. If it's exit, I exit. If it's something else, I say I don't know what this is. Right? And I do this in a loop just so that you can do multiple things. Okay? It's very important that this is a component. Why? For two reasons. One, you want to get the service inside it through Spring. You don't want to instantiate the service by hand. Secondly, you want Spring to call this after it finished all the initialization, and it can only call it if it's a component. It has to know about it, and it only knows about components or specialization of components, which are services, for example, and repositories and so on. There are other annotations which are inherit from component, basically. Okay? And really the last thing, so this is, I forgot about it initially. It's a seed. So there are multiple ways, yes, but we have an in-memory repo, and I want to seed also that. So a seed is, for example, to create some test data, right? You want your database to have some test data in it or some one-time initialization data. And usually I would say, okay, let's create a Flyway file, a Flyway migration script, which inserts stuff in the database. But we also have the in-memory repo that we have to populate. And if you insert in the database, of course, the in-memory repo will not work, will not know about this. So again, I have a command line runner, so something that executes at the end of the initialization. And I get the repo factory as usual and see if my stuff is empty and simply save the stuff. It's transactional because I want all of them to be saved in the same transaction and to be saved in general. In the case of using a database and not the in-memory stuff. And this is actually what I want to highlight. You can order stuff. So we want this to be executed first before the other one. Why? The other one, the other command line runner, depends on this, and this one, so this console command line runner actually blocks the stuff because we have this while loop, and basically we block, we expect the user to input, then we execute something, then we expect input again, and so on until we finish. So just to get this to run at all, basically the seed, we need to make sure that this is first. And you can just put the order annotation and put here the precedence. And I put it highest, meaning that it will be run always first and then all the other stuff. Okay? And this is for ordering anything, but in this case, command line runners. So if you have 3, they will be in the order of these ordered annotation values. This is just an integer, so it's ordered from the lowest to the highest. If you have 1, 2, and 3, 1 will be executed first, then 2, then 3. And that's it. Okay? So this is the setup, or this is the basis for your project. Basically, what you need to do is you need to go into each such repo or persistence or whatever, how we name the package. You have to go into each sub-package and add new repositories for your entities, create your own entities, and so on. Right? And then add the business logic in the services. And then lastly, of course, to create here in the console controller, as I called it, create commands for each stuff that is defined there, right? To ask a question and to answer a question and so on. Any questions apart from the ones in the project?
How do we unit test?
Yes. So unit tests, good question. Actually, the other group did not ask this. So I would expect also at least one unit test. So here you have an empty test, and you should create at least one test. I would expect you to test probably the business logic. So the business logic would be a very good place to test the stuff. And here I will be pretty flexible. You already have in-memory implementations of the repositories, right? And the advantage that we have is that you can pass, for example, you can construct your own in-memory repository factory inside the test. So the test should be isolated. It should not depend on Spring and so on. So not a Spring Boot test, but a usual JUnit test. So without this shit on the top. So I expect that you create your own in-memory repo, you populate it with some initial data or some data that matches your test case, you execute a business thing, and then at the end you check that your in-memory repo contains, for example, an additional question in the case of questions, right? That's the advantage of having these in-memory repos, that we don't need to mock. Does anybody know what mock means? Mock? Yes, dummy. So to create a dummy implementation for the repo, for example, to not use a database, but use in-memory objects. We already have this, it's our in-memory repo. So if the in-memory repo is correctly set up, then you can use that for your unit tests. It's not perfect, but I don't want to teach you also about mocks and so on because it's too long. Just use that. And for example, make a test that if you create a question, you have one additional question in your in-memory repo than originally. And if you also add a tag for it, there is also additional tag. And the values are the ones that you passed. And that's enough. That's one unit test, and I wanted to see it running. To run a test, you just press this arrow. right? You can run a method, or you can run a whole class which has multiple methods, and basically here you will see the results, right? This did not do anything, so it's green. But you should have some asserts, right? So you will have to do some asserts, and probably not with this assert thing, but with this assert class you have here stuff in it. So assert true, assert null, assert equals, not equals, and so on. And if I say, for example, assert equals, yes, I expect it to be 1, but it's actually 2, you will see, of course, the IDE, of course, tells me that I have a problem, but I get the exception, right? Because this assertion fails. So I expect that 1 equals 2, and I get the exception message. Okay? Good. Any other questions? Okay. Then I strongly urge you to start working on it until next week, because next week we will do 1 hour of Hibernate, and that's it. And then I just expect questions. If you don't have questions, then the week after I will start grading basically this assignment. Okay?